Everyone can hear me, I'll assume, right now. But good evening, everyone, and thank you so much for joining in on this Zoom, a historical look at African Americans in Johnson County. Y'all, I'd just like to say I'm encouraged that our library system would consider putting on a program like this. I was quite honored that they, Alyssa specifically, would ask me to do this. I absolutely love our library system's mission, which is to strengthen our community by connecting people and experiences. Connecting people and experiences. I like that mission because missions like that build bridges. We find ourselves in some rather weird times right now. Part of what makes these times kind of weird, besides the pandemic, is the fact that we tend to live in our personal bubbles, our safe places. And we tend to stay in our bubbles for the sake of perceived safety. While it can seem safe, there are certain detriments that it causes. The main detriment is this: it oftentimes hinders us from seeing things from different perspectives. One of the things I'm hoping to do this evening is possibly let some of you see something from an angle, a perception you've probably never seen or considered. In short, build a bridge. I've got less than an hour to build this bridge, so let me get started. We find ourselves in the middle of you probably thought I was going to say pandemic. After all, that's why we're doing this via Zoom and not in person. But we find ourselves in the middle of some of y'all thought I was going to say election. After all, election stuff has been inundating us for months and will continue to do so for another month or two at least. But we find ourselves in the middle of a census. It's easy to forget that there is indeed a census going on because there's so much other stuff going on at the same time. Census. As of the last census for Johnson County, Indiana, back in 2010, I came across some numbers that I was actually not expecting. I was expecting percentage-wise that African Americans would be second percentage-wise of the count in Johnson County. But actually, percentage-wise, African Americans were fourth in the makeup of the population of Johnson County, Indiana in 2010. Of course, whites first at about 94%, Hispanic Latino at about 3%, then Asian at about 2%, and African Americans at about 1%. That was 2010. I get a sense that the percentages will probably hold close to the same for 2020. But going back in time, 40 years, 50, 60, 70 years, if we go back 100 plus years, with the very first census in Johnson County, Indiana, way back in 1830, almost 200 years ago, what would we find in Johnson County, Indiana, from an African American perspective? What would we find? Here's something we would find. On the census documents themselves, the African Americans in the community would be identified in a category on the back of the form. The 1830 census listed free people of color in categories on the back of the form. The fact that a category like that was felt needed is really not something for us to celebrate, but I believe it is indeed a need to know perspective. That interesting category and placement on the form itself hints at the fact that back then, and just a little over 100 miles from where I'm sitting right now, African Americans that look like me, were legally enslaved. That's what we would find. But here's the question I really want to focus on this evening. Who would we find during that time period in Johnson County, Indiana, to honor, celebrate, and commemorate? Let us jump in a time machine and go back and take a look. For a talk like this, some of you who may be history buffs may have heard or read about some of the noted African Americans from Johnson County at the time. You might expect me to mention names like the following: Molly Mcgill. Maybe you'd expect me to introduce you to a woman of color named Molly Mcgill. Someplace I've seen her as Millie McGill, but she was an African-American lady and indeed one of the early pioneers in Johnson County, residing here in 1830. The preacher in me is quite impressed that Molly was a member of the First Presbyterian Church in Franklin way back in 1830, the year of that very first Johnson County census. If we were to get back in our time machine and move forward about 50 years, maybe you'd expect me to introduce you to a man of color whose name was John Pettiford, who, believe it or not, served as a Franklin City councilman way back in the 1880s. The preacher in me is quite impressed with this fact. After the Bethel African Methodist Episcopal Church was built where it now stands here in Franklin, at the dedication of the building in 1907, it was Mr. John Pettiford who had the honor of delivering the keys to the building. Taking another 50 years leap forward, maybe you'd expect me to mention names like George Crow, an African-American from Johnson County who was the first Mr. Basketball in the state of Indiana back in 1939, and who would eventually end up playing basketball professionally and would also end up playing baseball professionally for the Cincinnati Reds. Or maybe you expect me to mention his older brother, Ray Crow. While a great basketball player in his own right, Ray is more famously known as the head coach of the historic Crispus Attucks High School up in Indianapolis, whose basketball teams were known for winning Indiana State high school championships back to back and here and there all the way through the 50s. On a side note, if I got any family members online right now, I know some of y'all were supposed to be here, but our Uncle John, that's where he used to teach at back in the 1920s. But anyway, some of you also, that's just a side note from my family. Here's another picture of Ray. Some of you may recognize the person with him. That is Oscar Robertson. Oscar was not from Johnson County, but definitely one of the greatest basketball players our basketball state has ever produced. But the Crow brothers, they were from Johnson County. Maybe you'd expect me to introduce you to a husband and wife of color, like the Roystons, who lived in Greenwood. They are both passed away now, but they had 9 children, and the ones who are still living are in their 70s and 80s, just a generation ahead of me. So one doesn't have to go back far in time to get information on this wonderful couple. The fact that you don't have to go far back in history to see the impact of the Roystons had on Johnson County, Greenwood specifically, supports the fact that Greenwood was known as a sundown town not so many decades ago, which meant that you needed to be working your way out of town by sundown if you were Black. Matter of fact, when my family moved to Indianapolis in the mid-70s, that was still very, very much so the reputation of Greenwood. But the Roystons lived in Greenwood. They were a wonderful family and ended up becoming a beloved member of the community of Greenwood. The family had a successful business, great kids who excelled academically and athletically. Their oldest son, Claude, was a football star at Franklin College. He recently retired and is currently living down in Louisville after pastoring a rather large church down there. Their youngest son, Joseph, was also a star athlete and was a recipient of the Silver Star Medal while serving as a Marine in Vietnam. Back in the 1950s, the Roystons' home caught on fire and was destroyed. And they were greatly supported by the community that had grown to love them. The community loved them so much they helped greatly in getting their house rebuilt. This is a picture that I found in a newspaper article on the Roystons. And in this picture, Mrs. Royston and five of her daughters are looking at the foundation of their new home as it was being built. To show you just how few degrees of separation there are sometimes between folks in life, when I was researching the Roystons, I found out that my wife and I's wedding coordinator is a granddaughter of the Roystons. Her father was their youngest son's daughter. He was the Marine I mentioned earlier. And I see her name is TJ, and she's actually on this Zoom as well. Hi, TJ. Maybe you'd think that I would give mention to Ed Hammond, the first Black cop in Franklin, hired back in the 1970s. Some of you millennials and Generation Y folks may think the 70s were a long time ago. But I've actually bumped into folks on social media and in the real world who knew Officer Hammond, and he was a beloved policeman indeed. Mcgill, Pettiford, Crow, Royston, Hammond. Those would be some good and honorable names to focus on, and rightly so. But I'd like to center my talk this evening around a location, just a couple miles from where I'm sitting right now. It's a location today that is called the Palmer Park Recreation Center here in the city of Franklin over on Madison Street. But not so many years ago, the Palmer Park Recreation Center was called the Booker T. Washington Colored School. It was a school that served the Johnson County African American community for those in the 1st through 8th grades. The Booker T. Washington Colored School was no doubt a central hub for the African American community in Johnson County, Indiana. Because the city of Franklin in the early days of African Americans entering Johnson County always seems to have been the highest concentration of African Americans in the county. And thus the Booker T. Washington Colored School was in Franklin. It's set between the historic Second Baptist Church, where I pastored for quite a few years, and the historic Bethel Ame Church. If you can see this photograph here, you see Second Baptist near the bottom. And at the top is the Bethel Ame Church. And in between, you see Palmer Park Recreation Center. Where Palmer Park Recreation Center is located at right now, that's the same location that the Booker T. Washington Colored School was located. That's actually a picture of the school right there. Okay, my screen is not forwarding. There we go. And there's a historic marker that's sitting there right now in front of the Palmer Park, and right across the street, that building there, that's the AME Church. And looking east, there's a house that's sitting first. You see a house first, and the front of that red brick building, that's the Second Baptist Church right there. And that right there, that's the historic marker that is setting in front of the Palmer Park right there. And if you ever get a chance to go by there just for historic purposes, go by there just like this handsome young man right there did and take a picture by the sign. Well, this is the school, and this is what I want to concentrate on for the next few minutes. And the school operated between the years 1873 and 1951. I wish I could find a better picture of the school than this one. The actual building itself wasn't demolished until 1981, so surely there's some better pictures around somewhere. And if you ever come across one, please let me know, and I would love to get it. But the Booker T. Washington Colored School started out with the name the West School. In September 1928, by vote of the local school board, the West Schools was renamed Booker T. Washington. The name change was made in honor of one whom many considered, quote unquote, the outstanding man of his race in the educational field, Booker T. Washington. Many African American students in Johnson County from 1873 through 1951 received their formal educational foundation at this school. And here are some pictures that I've come across. Most of these are actually from the Johnson County Museum. They had quite a few pictures and some publications dealing with the school. I love some of these pictures because they actually show the side of Second Baptist Church. I love this picture right here because it's one of the few that I found of the inside of the school. And I really appreciate that. And like quite a few of the students are doing some basket weaving. That's actually the side of Second Baptist right there. It's got the same windows to this day. Because, reading quite a few local newspapers through the years dealing with Booker T. Washington, it shows that many graduations from the school were held at Bethel Ame Church and at Second Baptist Church. Many who received their educational foundation there went on to do great things. For the sake of time, I want to highlight just 4 former students. And it actually wasn't an easy task for me to pick just 4 former students, because many went on to become lawyers and doctors, teachers, administrators, preachers, politicians, soldiers, musicians, professional athletes, business leaders, and the list goes on and on. But these 4 I've chosen were indeed associated with Booker T. Washington Colored School, and I think they give us a good feel for the community. First, I'd like to talk about a lady named Hedy Fawcett Kane. Hedy lived from December 14th, 1864 until January 31st, 1961. She lived a long 97 years. Interestingly, she died January the 31st, 1961, just 6 days before I was born. The preacher in me is impressed that Hedy was a very busy and very faithful member of the Bethel Ame Church. One day, a couple years ago, when I walked into that church, I was checking out the early land deed that they had on the wall in the foyer as you entered the building, and there was Hedy's name on that deed. But she was not only a servant at her church. I read in newspaper articles from 1952 where she said and she said this in 1952, "Well, I had none personally. I mothered many children, and I am very fond of young people." I like that attitude, and with an attitude like that, it's no wonder she was actually one of the early teachers at Booker T. Washington School. Her life as a teacher no doubt had great impact upon the Johnson County community and beyond, as she would have touched the lives of so many young people. Hedy was actually the very first African American to attend Franklin High School. And she was also the very first African American to attend Franklin College. In her life, she was not only actively served in her church, and she served as a teacher of the Booker T. Washington Colored School, but she was also a businesswoman, a beautician or barber, a podiatrist, and believe it or not, a masseuse. And she was quite well known in the city of Franklin in all of those pursuits. I found it interesting that she lived in the house right next to Second Baptist Church. And when she actually died in the house that now serves as the annex to the Second Baptist Church. Researching the life of Hedy, I could tell that she was the kind of person who, as the old folks used to say down in the country where I grew up, they used to say, she just kept on keeping on. Born during the Civil War, she just kept on keeping on. No doubt she felt the pressure of being the first to integrate Franklin High School and Franklin College, but she just kept on keeping on. It appears that she left her passion for teaching to tend to her ailing father and his businesses, but she just kept on keeping on, y'all. She was married, but her husband died very early in their marriage, but she just kept on keeping on. She started losing her sight and lived for many of her last years completely blind, but she just kept on keeping on. I honestly don't believe that you or I would be having this Zoom meeting during the pandemic of 2020 if it weren't for the life of Hedy Fawcett Kane. Hedy's body is buried in Greenlawn Cemetery, just a few miles from where I'm sitting right now. Hedy Fawcett Kane, what a wonderful life she lived, and someone that Johnson County should be very proud of. The next person I'd like to highlight is another woman, Ethel Hornett. Ethel was a member of Second Baptist Church. She lived from July 27th, 1887 to June 12th, 1988. She lived for over 100 years. Doing a search of local newspapers, I could tell that Ethel was highly respected and well thought of in Johnson County. Because when I plugged her name into a search of local newspapers for the many, many years she lived, I got literally hundreds of hits. Ethel was quite the professional teacher through the years. She actually started teaching over in Columbus in 1909 and then went to teach for a bit in a place called Fort Smith, Arkansas. I've actually been there. Then in 1927, coming to Booker T. Washington School, where she was a teacher and principal, retiring in 1952. After 1952, you could tell she remained quite busy because July the 29th, 1967, was Ethel Harnett Day in the city of Franklin. Part of the reason why was because after retiring, her civic affairs included, but were not limited to, Secretary of the Women's Christian Temperance Union, board member of the Franklin Girls Club, vice president of the Council of Church Women. And I don't even have time to list all the stuff she did while a member of the Second Baptist Church. Ethel's body is buried at Greenlawn Cemetery, just a few miles from where I'm sitting right now. Ethel Harnett, much beloved teacher and principal of the Booker T. Washington Colored School. What a wonderful life she lived, and someone that Johnson County should be proud of indeed. So far, I've mentioned Hedy Fawcett Kane and Ethel Harnett. That's actually the two of them right there on this school photograph. Hedy Fawcett Kane and Ethel Harnett. The next person I'd like to highlight is George Marion Robertson. George lived from September the 23rd, 1887 to September 6th, 1988. Yes, another centenarian. He was actually born the same year and died the same year as Ethel. Just something I noticed while doing my research. But anyway, George is another former student of the Booker T. Washington School, and is quite the interesting fellow. I'm surprised more folks don't know about him. Let me acquaint you with him. Not only a former student of the Booker T. Washington School, he also graduated from Franklin College way back in 1911. This picture of him is in his college days, is from one of the Franklin College yearbook photographs. But y'all, George became a very, very prominent tenor vocalist. He would become the minister of music and choir director at quite a few of the larger churches up in Indianapolis. He actually managed and led groups of singers, not only in Johnson County and Marion County, but across the state of Indiana and also across the country. Groups like the Jubilee Singers, the Spiritual Quartet, the Pitchers Four, the Foster Hall Quartet, and the George Robertson Quartet. This is an interesting picture of one of his groups. And this wasn't locally, this is in Indiana, but this is out of a newspaper that I found way up near South Bend, Indiana. So they would travel all around the state. And this photograph right here, that's George on the far left, but this is an interesting photograph that I came across of George. And I actually found this photograph, not in a newspaper, but on a newspaper site, but at a jazz musician site. And that's George. But what's interesting about this also is that the gentleman that's seated, that's the grandson of Eli Lilly, the founder of Eli Lilly and Company. But y'all, back in the 20s, 30s, and 40s, these groups led by George were highly sought after. George groups sung at places like the Chicago World Fair and Carnegie Hall. I read where George had a group that sung before the Prince of Budapest, another group that sung before the President of the United States when the president visited Indianapolis. That would have been President Herbert Hoover. George had a group that sung in Boston once before, get this, the Queen of England. Who would have thought that a little boy from Booker T. Washington Colored School in Johnson County, Indiana, would end up singing before princes, presidents, and queens? I don't know, maybe we should have expected that out of him. His father was a highly decorated Civil War soldier. His mother, get this, was the last surviving charter member of the Second Baptist Church. She died in 1954, and also get this, she was the person who bought the first load of bricks used to build the current Second Baptist Church building way back in 1892. George's body is buried at Green Lawn Cemetery, just a few miles from where I'm sitting right now. George Marion Robertson, extraordinary worship leader and renowned vocalist. What a wonderful life he lived, and someone that Johnson County should be very proud of. Somewhere I read that George Robertson was the first Black man to graduate from Franklin College. Come to find out he wasn't. After digging through the Franklin College archives, I actually learned it was the following person: Arthur Henry Wilson. So the last person I'd like to highlight this evening is Arthur Henry Wilson. Arthur lived from September the 4th, 1882 to August the 4th, 1943. While he didn't approach the extremely lengthy lifespans of the previous three persons, he lived 60 years of extremely productive life. I couldn't find any evidence that he attended Booker T. Washington Colored School as a student, although I think it's highly likely that he did because his parents moved from Indianapolis to Franklin when he was just a child. I did see that he graduated from Franklin High School in 1896, going on to Franklin College, where he was indeed the very first person of color to graduate from there in 1902. And while at Franklin College, he proved to be quite the student athlete, starring in track, basketball, and especially football. Looking at old pictures like this one of Arthur, that's him back in the back right. Looking at old pictures like this, I would not have wanted to be hit by this man on a football field. because they wore very little protective gear. They didn't have much padding back in those days, y'all, when they played football. And making violent physical contact with someone built like Arthur would have been painful indeed. Through the years, Arthur would become a teacher and principal of Booker T. Washington Colored School. He was also a principal of colored schools in Rockville and Spencer, Indiana. Interestingly, after graduating from Franklin College, he made a decision to continue his education and graduated from Purdue Medical College of Indianapolis in 1907. Dr. Arthur Henry Wilson became a prominent physician. He started successful medical practices in Indianapolis and Evansville. In 1917, Dr. Wilson volunteered to serve in the United States Army during World War I. As a former pastor of Second Baptist Church, I'm proud that Dr. Wilson was a former member. And as one who spent quite a few years in the Army myself, I find it very interesting and very historic that Arthur Henry Wilson was one of the very first African Americans, the second actually, in the history of the United States Army to attain the rank of major. I saw where he eventually retired with the rank of colonel in the U.S. Army Reserves. His body is buried in Green Lawn Cemetery, just a few miles from where I'm sitting right now. Dr. Arthur Henry Wilson, former teacher and principal of the Booker T. Washington Colored School, military officer, and doctor. What a wonderful life he lived, and someone that Johnson County should be very proud of. As I close, I would like to say that if one studies the history of education in our country, it's rather easy to see the inequities African American children had when they had to attend colored schools. But even with those inequities, much good came out of colored schools, y'all. My mom is a former queen of a colored school. My father is a former mayor, politician, and businessman. He graduated from a colored school. Much good came out of colored schools like Booker T. Washington Colored School. And that's what I was wanting to spend a few minutes talking about. Many good people came to and went through schools like Booker T. Washington Colored School, and they went on to do great things. I would like to end with two quotes from Booker T. Washington himself, and then maybe we can open up for a few questions, comments, and discussion. Booker T. Washington said this: associate yourself with people of good quality, for it is better to be alone than in bad company. Booker T. Washington also said this: success is to be measured not so much by the position that one has reached in life as by the obstacles which one has to overcome. Johnson County, Indiana, let us be proud of our African American history. I hope I was able to mention some names and give you some information about some folks you may have never heard of. Some wonderful folks who had an impact not only locally and regionally, but also nationally. And with that, we've got a few minutes. If anyone has any questions, comments, and we're going to open it up for discussion.
I had a couple questions in the chat. A person wants to ask their questions. Or I can ask.
Yeah, go ahead and ask.
Okay. They wanted to know what grades were in the Booker T. Washington School.
That was 1st through 8th grades. And that's an interesting question, and what's and kind of going along with that is that here in Johnson County, for African Americans, they were allowed, and you could kind of indicate it through the fact that some of those folks went on to high school here and went to the Franklin High School, so they were. Even back in those days, when a lot of other folks African Americans weren't allowed to attend high school, they were allowed to attend here in Johnson County.
Okay. And how many teachers were there at that school?
That's an interesting question. I'm not sure how many. I've seen a couple lists, but I know about 8 for sure. But I wouldn't doubt if there were more than that through the years.
Okay. And then when the school closed in 1951, where did they start attending school?
It was just neighborhood specific. So most went to the schools that are open now.
Okay. And then we also had a question about, and I don't know if you have an answer to this, how to incorporate this information into our local schools.
Interesting question. And I see we do have actually some school officials on the Zoom, and I serve on a diversity and inclusion board for the school. So I might give this presentation to them and see if, or parts of it to see if they would like to, and they might want to. Dr. Clendenin and I are good friends, and I'm sure him and I will be talking about it.
Okay. Do we have any more questions? You can unmute yourselves and ask yourself or send it through the chat. But I do want to thank you again, Doug, for doing this presentation for me.
Thank you for
I enjoyed it the first time, and I definitely enjoyed it the second time. I'm going to have to tour Green Lawn Cemetery myself.
Yeah.
I have a question about George Marion Robinson, the musician. We learned through Heartland International Film Festival that was a great recording studio in Richmond, Indiana, and I believe it was called Gannett Records. And I was just curious to know if George Robinson and his jazz group, because that was a favorite type of music there, if they ever recorded there, or if you know about that.
I don't know about that. I do know he had links. Like I said, I found that one picture from a jazz site, so I would not have any doubt that he intersected with that place, Barbara.
Yeah, and they people came from all over to Richmond for that, and there's a mural on the side of the building there that still honors that particular place.
Yeah.
And which grandson of Lily was that? Do you know the name of the grandson at the piano?
That might have been J.K. Lily. I'm not.
Okay.
I'd have to check. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Any other questions? Any comments?
At the start, you mentioned that 100 miles south of Franklin was slavery. Was there ever any, quote, recorded slave-owning families within Indiana?
That is an interesting question, and the answer would be yes. Yeah, there were some slave-owning families, especially down in southern Indiana, and when they were confronted about slaves, it caused a lot of consternation, a lot of tension. But yeah, there are recorded slaves in Indiana, even when Indiana was a free state. Not much, but there were some. Yeah.
Another question. How did Franklin participate in the Underground Railroad?
That is not well documented. So there actually used to be a historical marker for a place here in Franklin that was a place that was suspected of being a location.
The station?
Station, yeah, for the Underground Railroad. The historicity of you was not as well established as it should have been to put up the marker. So if you go by there now, actually the marker has been taken down, and it's because we're actually looking for more solid data to support that. I think it did, and I think that would be this is me personally thinking that Indiana probably was a station, a few houses here. And that was probably one of the draws why Indiana Franklin was a hub for African Americans. Because back about years ago, I'd say 70, 80, 90 years ago, that I mentioned that census, we're at about 1% now, but back then Franklin had the population of African Americans was a lot higher, enough to support 3 churches. And looking at pictures from those churches, they would be packed out on Sundays. And so, I think Second Baptist actually at the building before they are where they are now, kind of across the street. They used to have a large wood building over there. They would have 200 people on Sundays for service, which was a goodly number. That would be a good number today, and especially back then. Yeah.
At the Washington school, did they just have one teacher for all the students, or were there more than one teacher at a given
He
time?
said 8.
Yeah, there were a number. Matter of fact, when you entered the door, and some of this I can say because I had a couple members of Second Baptist who attended the school. They were older, but when you walked in the front door, there was classes on the left and classes on the right, and they would have classes going simultaneously. So there were I've seen pictures where with at least 4 teachers and principals all at the same time. So there were a couple rooms working.
Can you tell us, Doug, what were many of the kinds of jobs that the African Americans in Franklin would hold?
Many of especially early on, when I say early, I'm talking 1830s to the 1900s. Most of those were farming, farm labor. I had a couple folks who owned their own farms. But then some of you might know Franklin had a rather large canning industry some years ago, and that held a lot of folks were employed through there. And when a lot of those jobs left, a lot of the people left as well.
Do you feel like because of the jobs leaving Franklin, do you feel like that is the key factor to why a lot of African American families left our city? Yeah,
that's an interesting question, Jess. That's one of the primary reasons. I think there are a few different reasons. That would be the primary one, was the loss of jobs. But also, I just noticed there was a dip that correlated with the fact that Johnson County was a central hub for the Klan. And
yeah,
that had an impact as well. Folks felt their lives endangered. It's interesting to read newspaper articles about Johnson County in the 20s, 30s, and the 40s. And actually, believe it or not, during the Johnson County Fair, they used to have Klan Day at the county fair. And some of the biggest Klan rallies I saw where they had a rally of 3,000 people back in the 20s at the Franklin High School. And the art theater would have hundreds of folks coming in and having rallies at the art theater. And some of the churches around the county would have Klan rallies. And so it wasn't during that, there was that time period was, yeah, it was very interesting.
Can you go back to the question earlier related to the jobs that people had during that, and around that time with Booker T. Washington and then Franklin back in that time? Because I do remember, I don't have the details because you're the historian, but I remember there was conversation around that West Madison Avenue about it being a thriving, healthy community from an economical perspective. So not everybody was canning, not everybody was a farmer. There were some other jobs that people were doing that might even be surprising.
Yeah, that's an interesting perspective. So those were the main things, but there were African American lawyers and doctors, business owners back in those days. It was I kind of showed you that picture of that overhead picture of the area, and that was a hub of the African American community around that school, indeed, and most of those houses were occupied by African Americans. And I found it interesting that just west of Bethel AME, it was actually in the paper where a young man bought that home and refurbished it, and started taking stuff apart, and it was actually an old log home. And he found some documents in there that supported the fact that the people that used to live there were African Americans. And so yeah.
Doug, in your research, have you come across anywhere, did the Washington School issue a diploma? Are there any recorded diplomas from Washington School?
It's funny you mentioned that, Paul, because I was just telling my wife, I said, I'm gonna have to get with Franklin schools and get, even though I might not be able to match up the names with the faces and all those photographs, I do want to get the names just so I can try to research what other people did as well. And so I need to see, I'm sure they have a list of some of those diplomas, of people that earned diplomas. I might not be able to get the diplomas, but I should be able to find names of the folks who received diplomas. So, because I find lists through the years of people who graduated from the school, not by name, but by number. And so, and those numbers come from, they were given to the newspaper by the school system. So they should be able to provide me with names to go along with those numbers. So yeah, that's an interesting question, Paul. I appreciate that.
And what's kind of a gift is there are still folks who are living that went to the school. And so some things we can still continue to learn about just, what life was like. With there was a not a fundraiser, but I'll just call it that to keep it simple. But there was a fundraiser in recent years for Bethel AME, and Second Missionary Baptist Church came alongside to support them. But Rafael Sanchez was there and was interviewing two of our older, I would call them mothers. I'd call them mothers, but he was interviewing them, and they were sharing what life was like and during the time of going to school, and talking about the teachers and, just the value of education. But I feel like it really is a gift that some of them are still living, so we can continue to learn about, just understanding that portion of history for Johnson County and Franklin.
Exactly where is Green Lawn Cemetery? Is that the one just east of 31, or is it buried within the city?
Just east of 31.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. All right.
Hey, Doug, I think you had a question in the chat.
Mm-hmm. The very last one. Was there a zoning put into place at the time that kept the black population segregated? And to piggyback off of mentioning KKK, do you think that plays a part in the demographics of the history of Franklin, Johnson County? No official zoning was put in place, but it's interesting that people that would sell mortgages, people that would rent, even if you pull up a newspaper from even the 1950s, when you go through the classifieds, it would say whites only. Now, that's here. So even though it wasn't officially zoning, it was in effect zoning. In reality, it was a type of zoning. And that, and you really get a sense of that reading the Indianapolis classified ads. And they're easy to come across. It was just out there and in the open. You see a headline, willing to rent to a black person, or, something like that. And so yeah. And the KKK, do you think they played a part in the demographics of the history? Yeah, no doubt. I can use my own family as an illustration from Tennessee. We were Stewarts. We were from Stewart County, Tennessee, and we were actually my family was actually forced off. And they weren't enslaved. They were free people of color in Tennessee, but they were forced off of their land by the Klan. And one of my uncles wrote a book about him. I kind of mentioned him. If I had any family here, I mentioned an uncle who taught at Crispus Attucks. He wrote a book where he talked about the night that they were forced off of the land. It's kind of interesting to read. And really, reading that, it makes it kind of really personal for me. Like I can remember I was raised by my grandfather, and my grandfather remembers that night as well. He was just a little toddler, but that night he remembered. What he remembered was the sound that the horses made. He said he could remember the hooves and the snorting of the horses out in the front lawn. And then when I read the book that my uncle wrote, he mentioned that as well. And so yeah.
Is that a publication that we could find?
What's that, Michelle?
Your uncle's book, is that in publication that we could find?
It's not in publication now. This was the name of it. Yesterday was tomorrow, and it's a hard book to find. But what's interesting, I did find this book, and when I bought it, my uncles had signed it for whoever had bought it. So I thought that was kind of cool to have a book that was signed by my uncle. His name, Yesterday Was Tomorrow by John L. Stewart.
Thank you for sharing your personal story about that with your family.
And I think because of his experience with the Klan, he became somewhat of an expert on the Klan. He also wrote another book called The KKK Menace, The Cross Against People. So yeah, he had a couple books out.
Doug, the couple you mentioned at the beginning,
The Roystons.
the Roystons, what was their business? You said they were in a business. What was their business?
They had, is TJ still on?
I think she might have
Left. Okay.
dropped. I think she had to go.
They had a well digging business. And actually, when a lot of the new homes were going up in Johnson County, they would hire them to come in and dig wells. So that was the business that he had. That's a good question. I wish I remembered more about that, the name of the business and this and that. But it was a great business. I think it ended up being quite lucrative for them.
Would they have put an advertisement in a paper?
Yeah, there's advertisements in the paper. Yeah. If I dig in these files enough, I could probably, if you'd asked me that about 10 minutes ago, I probably could have dug in there and found some of those advertisements. I think I downloaded some of them. All right, well, you guys, we are up on time. Maybe we can take one more question if anybody has anything. And I really appreciate everybody coming in and listening to me ramble for this hour. And
I always enjoy it.
Thank you.
Doug.
Thank you.
Nice job. Appreciate learning.
Thank you, Barb.
Thank you, Doug. And LaShawn, you look beautiful.
Oh, thank you.
Always looking good.
All right, everybody.
Like you highlighted some folks that Johnson County is proud of, and I think you and LaShawn have been a great blessing to our community. You've been a great blessing to me personally, and we do appreciate you so much.
Thanks,
Thank you,
Jeff. Jeff's only saying that because he lives right down the street. So
I gotta be nice to
he's just trying to be neighborly.
the class of our neighbor went way up when the Grays moved in. So yeah, we love having you here. Love sharing the love of birding with you, and just been fortunate to have you guys as friends. So
Thank you. Thanks, Jeff.
You too. You too.
All right. Anybody else? All right. Everyone, have a great evening, everyone. Thanks again for listening.